The first thing I saw was the sunlight. And that sounds strange, I know, but if you've spent enough years around thick timber, you notice when light starts reaching places it never used to. I was walking my north fence line just after sunrise with a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and my old lab, Murphy, dragging behind me like he owned the place, and suddenly the woods felt wrong. Too open, too quiet. Then I saw the first stump. Fresh cut, pale as bone, sap still running down the side like the tree was bleeding out right there in the dirt. About 20 feet later, there was another one. Then another, and by the time I reached the creek bed, I realized somebody had carved a damn highway straight through my property. Now, I've lived outside Blackwater Ridge, Tennessee, most of my life. My grandfather bought that land after Korea with money he saved welding pipeline down in Texas, and every generation after him added something to it. A barn here, fencing there, cedar rose along the east ridge to block winter wind. By the time the place got to me, it wasn't just land anymore. It was memory stacked on top of memory. My dad taught me how to track deer there. My mom planted blackberry bushes near the Southern Trail. Hell, my wife Nora and I had our first fight as a married couple because I spent more money on walnut saplings than kitchen cabinets. Those walnut trees mattered to me. People who've never owned timber think trees are just there, like grass. But mature walnut? Straight trunks, slow growth, good grain. That's retirement money standing in the dirt. Some of those trees were older than I was. A few probably older than my father. About a month before all this happened, a logging company called Mercer Timber started clearing the property beside mine. Big operation too. Feller bunchers, skidders, trucks running dawn to dark. The owner, Dale Mercer, had a reputation around the county. Loud guy, expensive sunglasses. Talked like every room belonged to him before he even walked into it. Folks either worked for him or stayed out of his way. I'd met him once at a hardware store years back when he cut in front of 3 people at checkout and winked like it was charming. That kind of man. At first, I didn't think much about the logging. Property lines out here are usually respected because everybody knows lawsuits over timber can ruin a company real quick. Plus, I had the boundaries surveyed twice over the years. Bright orange caps on steel pins every 100 feet. Posted signs too. You'd have to actively ignore them not to see them. Turns out, that's exactly what they did. I stood there in the middle of that clearing trying to count stumps, and honestly, my brain couldn't process it at first. It wasn't just random trees either. They'd taken the best ones. Walnut, white oak, a couple old cedars near the ridge that shaded the creek every summer. It looked surgical, deliberate, like somebody walked through my woods with dollar signs in their eyes. Murphy kept sniffing around the sawdust piles while I just stood there hearing chainsaws somewhere in the distance. I remember feeling weirdly calm at first, almost numb, because when something expensive breaks, your brain kind of protects you for a minute before the anger arrives. Then I saw one of my property markers laying in the mud, bent, like somebody had run it over on purpose. That's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. I drove back to the house, spread my survey maps across the kitchen table, and called Nora at work. She's a nurse over in Dalton County, practical about everything, not the type to panic. I remember she stayed quiet for a second after I explained what happened. Then she goes, "Luke, tell me you took pictures before touching anything." That woman's smarter than me in every possible way. So I grabbed my drone, my camera, every survey document I had, and headed right back out there. And the deeper I looked, the uglier it got. By noon, I had footage showing nearly 3 acres stripped clean across my north section. Deep tire ruts crossing the line. Broken markers. Freshly stacked logs sitting 50 yards from my property like trophies waiting for transport. And sitting on top of one of those logs, laughing with 2 crew members like it was just another Tuesday, was Dale Mercer himself. Dale Mercer looked up at me like he already knew why I was there, but didn't particularly care. He was sitting on this massive walnut log with one boot propped against the tire of a skidder, chewing sunflower seeds and spitting shells into the dirt, while 2 younger guys stood nearby, trying real hard not to make eye contact with me. The chainsaws had gone quiet for lunch, but the smell of fresh-cut timber still hung in the air, so thick you could taste it. I walked up holding my survey maps in one hand and my phone in the other, recording everything. I said, "You crossed onto my property." Simple. Calm. No yelling. Dale glanced down at the map for maybe half a second before shrugging. "Survey says otherwise." I actually laughed at that because it was such a stupid thing to say. Funny thing about surveys, I told him, they don't usually move around overnight. One of the younger crew guys smirked a little at that, but Dale shot him a look and the kid immediately stared at the ground. Dale slid off the log slow, brushed sawdust off his jeans, and stepped toward me. He had that kind of confidence some men build from getting away with things for too long. Listen, he said, your line cuts awkward through the ridge. My boys took what was in the path. Happens sometimes. Happens sometimes, I repeated. Yeah, he said. And usually folks around here handle things neighborly instead of acting like lawyers. That word stuck with me. Neighborly. See, people like Dale always use words like that right before they try screwing you over. They act like standing up for yourself somehow makes you the difficult one. I pointed toward one of the crushed survey stakes near the trail. Neighborly would have been knocking on my door first. His expression changed just a little then. Not guilt exactly, annoyance. Like I was creating paperwork he didn't want to deal with. He sighed dramatically and said, look, if a few trees got mixed in, I'll send somebody to smooth the ground over when we're done. Smooth the ground over. Like this man thought decades of growth could be fixed with a rake and an apology. I remember this heat climbing into my chest, but weirdly enough, the angrier I got, the calmer my voice became. You took black walnut off my ridge. Dale shrugged again. Trees grow back. That sentence right there. That was the moment this stopped being a misunderstanding and became personal. Because he wasn't talking to me like a landowner. He was talking to me like I was some idiot too soft to understand business. So I nodded once and said, all right. That's it. Just all right. And for the first time since I walked up, Dale looked slightly uncertain. Not scared, just confused. Like he expected a shouting match and didn't know what to do without one. I drove home slow with the windows down because I needed air before I said something stupid. Nora was already home when I got there, sitting at the kitchen table still in her scrubs, reading through Tennessee timber trespass laws on her laptop, like she was studying for finals. She looked up and asked, how bad? I dropped my camera bag onto the table. Bad enough he thinks I won't do anything. Now here's the thing people don't realize about timber theft laws in a lot of southern states. They're brutal. Mostly because timber companies used to pull shady stuff constantly back in the day, crossing lines, taking extra acreage, pretending it was accidental. So lawmakers got tired of it and built consequences that hurt. Triple damages. Not replacement cost. Triple. And walnut prices had gone crazy lately. Nora stared at the drone footage while I paced circles around the kitchen. How many trees? I stopped counting at 47. Her eyes widened. Luke. Yeah. That night, while most sane people were probably watching Netflix or sleeping, I sat in my garage cataloging every single stump like a crime scene investigator. Species. Diameter. Approximate board footage. Market value. Estimated age. I even matched several stumps to old photos I'd taken over the years during deer season because those trees had been in the background for decades. You want to know the weirdest part? The more paperwork I did, the less emotional I became. It stopped feeling like revenge and started feeling like math. And math is cold. By 2 in the morning, I had a spreadsheet that made my stomach turn. Just the walnut alone came out to numbers I didn't even want to say out loud. Some veneer-grade black walnut can sell for insane money if it's mature and straight enough. Dale's crew hadn't randomly crossed my line. They cherry-picked premium timber. They knew exactly what they were doing. The next morning I printed everything. Photos, GPS coordinates, survey maps, drone stills, timber valuations. Then I drove into town wearing the only decent button-up shirt I owned and handed the whole packet to an attorney named Gene Holloway, who looked exactly like every small-town lawyer should. Suspenders, silver mustache, coffee breath, probably born 60 years old. Gene flipped through the documents quietly for a while before finally looking over his glasses at me. You got him dead to rights, he said. I asked him what that meant financially. He leaned back in his chair. If a judge believes it was intentional, he tapped the paperwork. This could bury them. I didn't feel victorious hearing that. Honestly, I felt tired. Because once lawyers get involved, things stop being simple. Still, by that afternoon, Mercer Timber received a certified invoice itemizing every tree they took. Professional. Detailed. Cold as a hospital hallway. 3 days later, Dale himself showed up at my house. I saw his truck rolling up the driveway while I was repairing fence wire near the barn. He climbed out wearing sunglasses and carrying none of the swagger from before. Not gone entirely, just cracked around the edges. He walked over slowly and said, "You really gonna do this?" I kept twisting wire without looking up. "Already did. You're asking for insane money. You took expensive trees." He pulled off his sunglasses then, and I could finally see the irritation underneath all that fake confidence. "Luke, come on. Court over some timber." I finally looked at him. "You crossed marked property lines." It was a mistake. I laughed right in his face. Couldn't help it. "Dale, your skidder ran over my survey pin." For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he made the mistake that destroyed whatever chance he had left. He stepped closer and lowered his voice like we were two men making a private deal. "You know how this county works," he said. "People who make trouble tend to regret it." There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. A threat. Tiny one. Polite one. But still a threat. And the second he said it, I stopped seeing this as business entirely. I saw exactly who he was. A man who'd spent years bullying smaller landowners into silence because fighting back was expensive and exhausting. Only this time, he picked the wrong property. Because what Dale didn't know standing there beside my barn was that Jean had already filed the claim that morning. And by the end of the week, the state forestry investigator would be walking every inch of my boundary line with a camera in hand. The state investigator showed up 4 days later in an old green pickup covered in mud and pine needles, the kind of truck that tells you somebody actually works for a living. His name was Carl Benson, late 60s maybe, quiet voice, weathered face, looked like he'd spent 40 years arguing with chainsaws and winning. He walked my property line with me for nearly 6 hours without saying much, just taking photos, measuring stumps, checking GPS points against the survey records. Every now and then he'd kneel beside a cut and shake his head a little. That was somehow worse than if he'd gotten angry. At one point we reached the crushed survey marker near the ridge, and Carl crouched beside it for a long moment before looking up at me. "This didn't happen by accident," he said. Hearing somebody else say it out loud changed something in me. Until then, part of me still wanted to believe maybe this whole thing had spun out of control from simple carelessness. But standing there in the quiet woods with sunlight pouring through the gap where my walnut trees used to stand, I realized Dale Mercer hadn't made a mistake. He made a calculation, and he thought I'd be too intimidated, too tired, or too broke to challenge him. Carl's report hit fast after that. Intentional trespass, unlawful harvest, property boundary violation. Enough paperwork to make Mercer Timber's insurance company start sweating bullets. Apparently, once insurers hear the phrase triple damages, everybody suddenly becomes very motivated to settle things quickly. Funny how that works. About a week later, Jean called me while I was feeding hay near the back pasture. "They want to meet," he said. "Dale?" "No," Jean replied. "Lawyers." Which means Dale's scared. The meeting happened at a big office building in Knoxville with glass walls and polished floors so shiny I felt guilty walking across them in work boots. Nora came with me because she didn't trust me not to say something reckless, which honestly was fair. Mercer Timber had 3 attorneys sitting on one side of the table. 3. That's usually how you can tell rich people are nervous. Dale sat at the far end wearing an expensive gray suit that somehow made him look even less trustworthy than before. He avoided eye contact while one of the lawyers started talking in that careful corporate tone people use when they know they're standing on thin ice. "Mr. Grady," he said, "our client acknowledges there may have been confusion regarding the boundary line." Jean cut him off immediately. "No confusion. Continue." I almost smiled at that. The lawyer cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table. "Mercer Timber is prepared to offer compensation for the value of the harvested timber as a gesture of good faith." Gesture of good faith. That phrase nearly made Nora choke on her coffee. I opened the folder. The number inside was big enough to change most people's lives, and it wasn't even close to what they actually owed. I looked over at Dale for the first time since the meeting started. "You ran over my survey marker." One of the attorneys jumped in quickly. "There's no need to personalize." "No," I said calmly, still looking at Dale. "I want him to answer." The room went quiet. Dale shifted in his chair and finally muttered, "Things get missed on job sites." I leaned back slowly. "You know what's funny? If you'd walked up to my door that first day and just admitted what happened, we probably could have figured something out." And that was true. That's the part people online never understand when they hear stories like this. Most folks aren't unreasonable. If he'd owned the mistake early, acted human about it, showed even a little respect for the land he destroyed, this never becomes a courtroom problem. But arrogance has a price, and some men pay it so often they stop noticing the bill. I pushed the settlement folder back across the table untouched. Triple damages, I said. Or we let a jury decide how intentional this looked. One of the lawyers exhaled hard through his nose. Another rubbed his temples. And Dale? Dale finally looked directly at me with something I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Fear. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, he realized money couldn't automatically make the problem disappear. The negotiations dragged another 2 weeks. Calls back and forth. Revised offers. Threats disguised as legal strategy. At one point their attorneys hinted the process could take years if I kept pushing. Jean just laughed afterward and said, "That's lawyer language for please stop hurting us." Then one rainy Thursday morning, it ended. Full payment. Every dollar. Triple damages included. I remember sitting at the kitchen table staring at the final settlement papers while rain hit the windows and Nora made coffee. Neither of us said much for a while. It didn't feel triumphant the way people imagine. It felt heavy. Because the truth is, money doesn't replace old trees. You can't fast forward 30 years of growth. You can't recreate shade that's been there longer than your marriage. You can't put history back once it's cut down and hauled away on a logging truck. A month later, I started replanting the ridge with my nephew Ethan. He was 14 at the time, all elbows and muddy boots, asking 1,000 questions about chainsaws and lawsuits and whether Dale Mercer hated me now. Probably. But that wasn't really the point anymore. We planted walnut saplings along the damaged section one by one while the evening sun came through the hills. Tiny little things, barely waist high, looked fragile against all that open space. Ethan asked me if I thought I'd live long enough to see them fully grown. I told him maybe not. Then I stuck the shovel into the dirt and said, "But somebody will." And honestly, I think that's what bothered Dale the most in the end. Not the money, not the lawsuit. It was the fact that land remembers people long after pride burns itself out. These days when I walk that north ridge, the scars are still there if you know where to look. The younger trees sway different in the wind. Too thin still. Too new. But the boundary markers stand brighter now. Steel reinforced. Concrete set. Impossible to miss. And every now and then somebody around town brings up what happened with Mercer Timber, usually over coffee or bait shop counters, and opinions are always split. Some people think I did the right thing. Others think I should have let it go and kept the peace. Maybe that's the real question here. At what point does keeping the peace just become permission? Because where I come from, a man's land is more than dirt and fences. It's time. It's labor. It's memory. And if somebody can take that from you without consequences, then none of us really own anything at all. So I want to know what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken the settlement or dragged them all the way through court? And if Dale had apologized from the beginning, does that change everything? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this tend to divide people real fast.